Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Life by Design podcast. On this week's episode, I talk with Bridget Wood, a mother, coach, and podcaster. As a coach and mentor, Bridget supports women to elevate their experience of motherhood and overcome overwhelm so they can thrive in both their family and professional lives. For over 9 years, Bridget has co-hosted the weekly podcast Nourishing the Mother, born out of a love of parenting and personal growth, to become a welcome best friend to mothers across the globe yearning for community and connection. A mother of three, her own experience of pregnancy loss, parenting neurodivergence, and balancing career, motherhood, and intimate relationships informs her area of focus. In this week's episode, expect to learn the importance of developing a secure attachment with your kids, punishing your kids, conscious parenting, the best advice for new parents, and much, much more. Enjoy the episode. Now, guys, before we start this week's episode of the podcast, I want to talk to you about the Life by Design Mastermind. The Life by Design Mastermind is the mastermind for go-getters and high achievers who are looking to create a more successful, fulfilling, and balanced life by design. If you're serious about transforming your life, achieving your goals, and living a life on your terms, then the Life by Design is your golden ticket. Head over to the show notes and click on the link for more details about the program. Bridget Wood, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm excited to talk. You don't know this yet, but I am about to enter the world of parenting and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing. And for that reason, it was only last week, I think, that I put out a post on both Instagram, Facebook, asking who are the best conscious parenting people. Your name came up. And so you are the first of many to come who's going to teach me all about parenting, which I'm excited for.
Wow, it feels like a big task, actually. Like I feel like there's a big responsibility in that.
If I take one nugget, I'm happy for today.
There's always, it's just one of huge growth, which is exciting.
Yes, a new initiation for me. Before we get into all things conscious parenting, can you give the guys a 60 to 90 second spiel of who you are and what has got you to where you are today?
Yes, sure. So I'm a mother of three. So my oldest is 11 now, my youngest is 5. And I thought that I would enter motherhood with the greatest amount of consciousness you can possibly muster. So, of course, I read all of the books and I was very much an armchair expert, and then became quite leveled by the experience of parenting and thought I could bring professionalism to it, and did in a way, but also have very much learned a lot along the journey. So I have a corporate background, moved into coaching and mentoring women about 8 years ago with the podcast that I run, and really all about how do we bring a conscious parenting and conscious relating lens to our mothering and parenting experience so that we can recognize just how much, yes, we're raising children, but we're also raising ourselves alongside that experience of raising them.
How would you describe conscious parenting to someone who hasn't heard that terminology before?
Yeah, I laugh sometimes when I say this, because I think in some moments conscious parenting is simply becoming conscious of your own unconsciousness. So the basically the backpack of baggage that you bring to a moment with your baby or child that you realize isn't actually about your child in front of you, but it's about all of the beliefs and all of the stuff that you carry with you that you're projecting upon them. So that, I think, is the opening the lid of what conscious parenting is. It's like, what do I bring first of all to my experience of parenting? And then it's really having a touch point into who this child is and how can I raise them knowing that they are going to imprint their nervous system on my own. And so with that comes a huge responsibility to know my nervous system and learn how to regulate it as best I can. And also that our child learns their attachment pattern and their, fundamental way of relating from their primary caregivers. And I mean, if we think too much about that, it can become like a huge responsibility, right? But also I think an exciting one when we recognize just how important it is to value ourselves in this role of raising children and recognizing that, yes, it's a responsibility, but it also gets to be a ride as well in knowing them and knowing ourselves.
What would you say is the biggest difference between your first, who I think you said is 11, and your youngest, who is 5? What would you say is the biggest difference in terms of how you parent?
I probably have a bit more fun now. I think with my first, I was quite anxious. I was quite determined that there was a right way to do it. And I certainly put an enormous amount of pressure on myself I think it's really easy in this era of parenting. I mean, back then we hardly had Instagram. But I think now for a lot of parents, there's just so much advice out there and so many ways that you can be better and do better, that it can create almost a disembodied experience of parenting, because you've got yourself trying to show up with your child, and then you've got all this stuff in your head about like what the right way is and how I should speak and what tone I should use. And I think now I probably have more fun because I have the lived experience and I guess more insight into human behavior than I had then.
My partner and I have been told that a number of times in terms of just the difference between their first kid and potentially, almost taking it too seriously or trying to hold on too tight, to kind of your point. And I have no doubt we'll probably do the exact same thing, even though we've heard it 1,001 times. It's interesting, for me as someone who takes this very seriously in terms of moving into this space and looking for the right advice. I wouldn't know as a male where to look. But one of the things that's been really interesting for me is, we've got a lot of friends who have got kids, and there's probably 8 or 9 families of which I really like the way that they do parenting. And to channel our energy into kind of those guys and have conversations with them has been really valuable and insightful. And they all say the same thing. You'll learn your own way, which is good, but also it's nice to kind of hear how they've gone about it as well. If someone was seeking advice, potentially similar to me, entering this space for the first time, where would someone even start? And to your point, in a lot of industries, probably all industries, the overwhelm of information can be quite hard to kind of rummage your way through. But where does someone start in your eyes?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I mean, I certainly began, I think, with a book which was called, can I swear on this podcast?
Please. Absolutely.
It was called How Not to Fuck Them Up, which I think isn't that the question every parent starts?
That's my biggest fear.
Like, how do I
or
not
minimize it?
And so this book had drew on a lot of evidence. Is it best for the mother to stay home the whole time, or is a hybrid of work and home life better? And like, how many rules? Do you be permissive or do you be authoritarian? Like, what is it like to be that middle point? And I think where a parent goes, first of all, is inward with themselves to ask, what are the values that I really want to instill in a child? What are the things that I'm still trying to reconcile from my own experience of my upbringing? What big judgments do I perhaps have on the outside world that I'm maybe afraid that my child might come into contact with? And when you look at the families that you do admire, what is it about them? Is it the style of relating that they have with their children? Is it their gentleness? Is it their leadership? So that can then help you refine, okay, well, where do I want to go for information? Because often we don't really need the information until we're on at that step. Like if I told someone to go to information about how to deal with tweens when they're about to have a baby, that's like irrelevant. It's about how do I meet this next step in front of me? And for the next step in front of you, it might be, how do I support a really secure attachment in the first month of my child's life, right? Like, what do I want to do in the postpartum period so that my partner and I both feel like we can really rest into this experience of getting to know our child? Like, that's where I would begin. And then get the next thing as you need it.
Yeah. And that's, I feel underprepared with that school of thought, which is really interesting because we've only, my partner's 16 weeks at time of recording. So I find myself in a dance of being really present to what is now. Yeah. And also, to a certain degree, prepping for what is the future, of which the feedback that we've got is plan as well as you want, mate. You're going to get hit for 6 anyway. So I'm dancing between like being prepared and speaking to a lot of parenting experts over the next 12 months is a big piece for me. But to your point, that's kind of given me a little bit of peace knowing that, potentially just try to enjoy the journey and don't think too far ahead. Is that what I'm kind of reading?
And really try to meet the child that's in front of you, like get to know cues, because I think sometimes what happens is we get too much in our head about the nurse said this, and it depends what kind of experience you go down in terms of childbirth, right? Like if you go in more of a medical approach, then you can hand over authority. And so it's kind of, how do you find your own again? And getting kind of clear on learning a baby's cues and learning how your body relates to that baby, because how your body will relate to her, how your nervous system will relate to your baby will be different to how your partner's does. And being in that dance of like, how do we settle into a new being in our life? How do we take care of each other so that our child feels taken care of.
What would be your suggestion for me in the second and third trimester as I kind of make my way into it before the party even begins?
I think that it's amazing how much babies perceive even in the womb. And so you can like bring some massage and you can bring your own like form of connection with that baby because it's already, even now at 16 weeks, would be getting to know your voice, right? Like the tone of your voice. And like, isn't that a most amazing thing to think?
That's wild.
Already like your baby is learning its environment and learning the most important relationships in its life now.
Yeah, it's wild because I talk to my baby most nights, and it's a, you know, before we go to sleep with my partner, and it is a really interesting insight that potential, like we are so mindful, and I don't want to, I'm dancing the line between being really cautious and also protective and knowing what's healthy and what's not, but even just what, you know, my partner and I protect our energy quite well, but even mindful of the energies and the circles and the environments we put ourselves in, knowing that everything's starting to kind of be fed to the baby as well. So, you know, we don't watch the news, none of that type of thing. Like we're really mindful of that. But even, yeah, you talking to that is really interesting. Is there anything that you did in the second or third trimester in terms of that nurturing?
Yeah, I think for me, it was, I think recognizing that you're going through a huge portal of transformation and I imagine if you're thinking this consciously about this stage, then you're likely thinking about the birth and you're thinking about kind of the way that you want to do that. And so my third child was born at home unassisted. That wasn't the plan, but she was born at home, which was a very, very different experience to my first. She was born in hospital and I didn't really know like other options right back then. And so I think what I did then was prepare as much as possible my body for the transformation and really bringing my husband on that journey as well of how he could support me both physically and emotionally. I think that the more a couple can get on the same page around what this shift is going to bring them, and you can't know the detail, but you just need to be willing and open for it to change you. I think the more adaptable you'll be to the transformation that's taking place. And I mean, a woman's body's being prepared from the moment of conception for that experience. And when labor's largely left alone, that experience happens on its own. However, it's also helpful to not attach and need it to be a certain way, because sometimes we don't always get the birth experience that we want, that we get the one that we need, and that sometimes in a roundabout way can benefit the relationship and the family too.
We found ourselves with that school of thought being a little bit rigid. Our desire is for a home birth, and we were kind of almost fixated on it initially. And then we had a bunch of girlfriends who also had the same plan and last minute had to kind of end up in a hospital. So we've been able to kind of loosen our grip on that, having the desired outcome, but also being mindful that things don't always go according to plan. So that's a helpful thought as well. You spoke about being on the same page with your partner. What does that look like? Are you talking about kind of medical interventions? Are you talking about the style of parenting? Like what exactly do you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to be mindful of the relevant conversations at the point that you're at. So, you know, when you're pregnant, it is a conversation around, okay, like I'd really love a birth experience like this, and I'd like you to advocate for me like that. So for your birth, it might be, we have plan A, which is at home, no intervention, beautiful experience. Plan E, it's a general anesthetic, you know, cesarean, not what I want. But if that happens, how would I want my partner to show up? Like, would I want, if I'm out, I would like my partner to be able to have skin to skin with that baby. And so if that's me, I'm communicating that, like why that's important, so that my partner would know that's really something that she wants me to advocate for and step up for and own my authority to have those conversations around. And so that's what I mean by getting on the same page here. I think getting on the same page when you have a newborn might look like, you know, wanting to foster skin to skin contact with the both of you, or it's, hey, like I'm not comfortable with cry it out, for example, as a methodology. How do you feel about that? This is why. And those are the kinds of conversations that I think are important to get on the same page around. And I think that also comes from having conversations about your own challenges in your own upbringing, because whether you're conscious of it or not, that's what comes out in early parenting and any stage of parenting is how we were parented.
Which ultimately is my greatest fear, is with a quite an interesting upbringing. I actually did an ayahuasca ceremony, must have been like 4 weeks ago, and with the intent to be shown what I need to see before parenting. And essentially, ayahuasca was like, well, what's your greatest fear? And it was that I would replicate the behaviors and environment of which I had as part of upbringing. 250 therapy sessions later and 30 odd psychedelic journeys, I'm hoping that I've made a little imprint into clearing what has been. But that is ultimately, my biggest fear, especially under the pressure of, whether it's sleep deprivation or the other stresses that come with parenting, that will be at the forefront and hopefully kind of be embodied and grounded enough to not have that kind of come through. But it's interesting that you've planted the seed there. When you think about mainstream schools of thought, and again, I'm a very ignorant person in this space, so I don't even know if a mainstream school of thought exists in kind of parenting. But when you think about kind of mainstream schools of thought around parenting, which one is most concerning to you in terms of maybe a narrative that has been pushed for 10, 20, 30, 40, however many years, and you're like, after the time that I've spent in research and the way that I've mothered, I would be going the opposite, or
I think the great thing that has happened in the last 10 years is that the consciousness has really shifted around an understanding, at least in my awareness, of so many behaviors that we have as humans being driven by our nervous systems and perceptions, and not actually as a premeditated agenda. And the idea of there being a premeditated agenda for a particular behavior is a very behaviorist lens. So that's almost like, a child deserves to be punished because they knew that was wrong and they did the wrong thing. And I think that there's a real problem with that, this idea that we can control a behavior by, punishment or by withdrawal of love or, any kind of punitive measure. I think that isn't rooted in any strong understanding of human behavior and how to get the most out of a human being. But then, we also have, in response to that, some trending in the opposite direction, where some parents then struggle with permissiveness and struggle with almost focusing too much on being their child's friend rather than their child's leader. So I do think that if we can name a best place to land, it probably is in this authoritative space, which kind of says, I'm willing to hear like your feedback or your frustrations and your emotions around this thing, but this is why I'm a no on this issue, or this is why I can't let you da da da. And so you're setting a boundary and you're clear on your rule, but you allow your child to experience their feelings in relationship to your limits.
That speaks so nice, because punishment was definitely the highest value, almost, it felt like at times in my household growing up. And dancing between, that, as you said, and that kind of best friend as a mum or dad, and where you kind of landed the authoritative figure. Even for me, the word authority still I feel a bit in my nervous system, which is interesting.
Yeah. And I can see also too what potentially can happen with the parent who punishes is a parent who often doesn't have any other tools, right?
Yeah.
I say this to parents, when we're feeling threatened in our bodies, we threaten others. When we become scary when we're scared. So the parent who is threatening, who is scary for a child, that's their own internal experience that they're having, that they don't have governance over. So like in the same breath as we really want to move away from those styles, and we likely have a lot of judgment on parents who do this, there also needs to be a degree of empathy for understanding why they might have behaved in that way. And also too, that if they're the parent who then swings from that to wanting to be your friend, wanting to buy you things, wanting to kind of be back in connection, that kind of behavior is motivated by the shame and guilt that they're feeling because of the punishment that they've unleashed.
I often see parents talk about my best friend when they're talking about their kids. And for me, that feels a little bit murky. How does that sit with you as you kind of dance in between these places?
Yeah, so it's an interesting one. The child's designed to individuate, right? Our job as parents is to hand over autonomy, to hand over independence, to hand over their capacity to grow themselves up in the world. And if we have over-identified into our child and have derived a sense of our self-worth from who they are, which is very easy to do. You know, it's very easy to become enmeshed with our child, particularly if we have a lot of maybe infatuation with our growth alongside them or our healing alongside them. We can over-identify with them and then lose ourselves in them. And then, of course, you know what happens as a coach. What happens when your identity feels threatened is that you then cling on and you then need them to be who you've cast them to be. So I don't think that bestie is the best way to frame your relationship with your child, because I also really like, if they're your bestie, can you handle them turning around when they're 8, like my daughter does sometimes when she's angry and says, I hate you? Because really you want to be that like smooth pond where like you can just let that come to you. You are the more regulated nervous system in that moment who doesn't need to react to those words. But if you're entangled with being liked by your child, then you will respond to that and become the child with your child.
So how would you identify self in that? So the words that kind of really stood out to me before was like, again, something for me to be mindful of what I felt in my body around the authoritative language. Even that, I'm like, okay, I've got something to explore and I haven't even started yet.
Yeah.
But that authoritative, the leadership word kind of really resonated with me. But how would you describe yourself, maybe from an identity point of view, as we're kind of navigating this punishment and at the other end of the scale, bestie?
Yeah, I think a great way to frame it, like in terms of relating to our child, is to consider that we have like one foot in their experience and their work. And that allows us to have empathy. It allows us to put ourselves in their shoes, allows us to see what they're experiencing. But then we also have one foot firmly planted in ourselves, you know, in who we are, in reminding ourselves why it is that we maybe hold the boundary that we do, or why it is that we've said no to whatever it is that they're wanting. So that that almost acts as like a break to our own escalating emotion. We can just touch them and feel into that experience that they're having, and they're like, you know, almost modulate their emotions because we've got a foot in ourselves, like we're okay here.
One of my favorite Carl Jung quotes is something along the lines of, the child's greatest burden is the unmet dreams of
unlived life of the parent.
Unlived life of the parent. Do you see that a fair bit in your work?
Yeah, I do. And I think that leads me to the other point I want to make too, which is that kids aren't looking for us to be perfect. Like they actually want to see the sparkle in our eye. Like, what's the thing that gives us life? And sometimes the thing that gives us life is not going to be making them the center of our world.
This is significant. Again, I find myself a little bit ignorant kind of making statements around this, but what I find fascinating about that is I've always danced with, obviously my role as a coach is to help people live their best life. I always found it really interesting, people telling their kids to live their best life when they're not living their best life. How does that, because again, from what I hear, and I'm very surface level, they're watching more what you do than what you say, but how does that sit with you when you're trying to empower your kids to live their best life when you aren't embodied in what you're saying?
Yeah, I think the words are empty often unless they're backed by action, right? And we can say all of the great platitudes, but unless we're also willing to walk ourselves to our own edges of fear, because, you know, our best life is often on the other side of us working through our own fear. And so for mothers or parents, it might be this fear of like, well, if I go and do the thing that I love, like it'll take away from my family, or it'll take away from my child, or I'll let them down in some way, because we have an experience in our own childhood of our parents prioritizing themselves or being absent from us. And that was painful. So we don't want to recreate that for our own children. So we end up in this like bind. I think that, you know, the greatest way we can lead our children is to lead ourselves through our own human tussle with those parts of us that know that we want more, but really struggle with, you know, our version of comfort, which is often however we've designed our life to prop up our existing narratives about who we're hard done by and where we're right.
So what do you reckon every bloke needs to know in that first year? Talk to me as if I'm blind going into this first year, because I am blind and I have no idea what I'm doing. So
I love the humility though. Like it's
this is the most humble pie I'm about to eat. So what do I need to know?
So there's going to be a huge hormonal shift in your partner where the oxytocin that she gets from her relationship with you is going to shift for a little period, likely to your child. And so your ego might take a hit, your maybe masculinity might feel like it's being hit a bit, because she's designed from an evolutionary biology point of view to become infatuated with the baby.
She looks at her stomach a number of times a day, so it's definitely already started.
It's already happening. So she's designed to, right? It helps her bonding experience. And there's a part of her experience that no one else can enter, that is hers and the baby's alone. And that your role is often in allowing her to bond with that baby first and foremost, because the most important thing in that baby's world is her. Like, it's for sustenance. For a baby, actually, for the first 9 months, thinks that it's part of the mother, actually doesn't realize it's a separate person. So for you, supporting and protecting whatever kind of connection she needs to learn to foster with herself and that baby is important, and recognizing that the nature of your connection will just shift. I do think that the first year of your first child's life is one of the most challenging years that a relationship goes through. But I think that as long as you're staying open and communicating, noticing the ways, like my husband, we didn't have this consciousness back then. We've been together for 22 years. But back then, he really lost himself in his work because he just didn't feel purposeful or like he was making a difference really with me and our baby, who I was obsessed with. So he went and got his worth somewhere else. So just noticing how you can do that, but also how can you come and check back in, and maybe look at like how you can care for her in ways that also support her to continue to open up to you and continue to find her softness with you and continue to find the new form of your relationship as you navigate becoming a family of 3.
So when you say it challenges the masculinity, what exactly do you mean by that? Just so I'm prepped for that bit.
Well, I mean, it depends, of course, on everybody's sexual relationship. But sometimes if a woman's needs, like if her needs for love and desirability and connection, if you imagine that oxytocin's like the love hormone, if she's having that being met by the baby, then she's less likely to be seeking that from a partner because she's got it. Like there's nothing missing. And so it helps partners to recognize, oh, this is not personal. This is like biological. And so how do I show up and meet her and the baby and support her and support the changing nature of our relationship in a way that recognizes that's happening, doesn't take it personally, but also is secure enough in myself and value myself enough to know that, I'm still staying relevant in this relationship and, I'm still a priority in some form, knowing it might be different.
It's a dance that I've been sitting with a lot, more so because I do a lot of work with couples, and that first year for a lot of them becomes this subtle slippery slope of just this continued evolution of them falling apart, essentially. Yeah. So I've been really mindful of like, what's my role without being too needy? Where am I of value? Where do I just go and focus on me? Not in a selfish way, but knowing that, I'm kind of not the priority anymore. Like I'm dancing that bit between how much am I in, how much am I doing my thing, how much am I trying to maintain this contact? And I don't have the answer. So I'm glad you're here.
I think one of the things I'm still so grateful for my husband for would be the way that he would feed me. Like also like a woman who's breastfeeding often becomes ravenous, right? Like you're eating double what you're normally eating. So just the way he would cook me meals would be like the best thing ever. And if that nourishes your partner and she's appreciative of that, then that also becomes a way that you feel needed and connected and like you're purposeful in the relationship and that there's some reciprocity.
Because from what I gather, there's a lot of blokes who, at least this is the way that I've been feeling, I kind of a little bit helpless and hopeless because I'm like, you're okay, like what I do? I can set the home up and I can get everything as prepared as possible. But at the end of the day, you're carrying the baby, I just feel a bit hopeless and helpless. And from what I understand, there's a lot of blokes that also feel that in the first year. Am I right in saying?
Yeah. And I think too, it can be challenging for men who are excellent at providing, environments and fixing things and problem solving. And often a baby being born and learning to relate and care for this baby, it's not a problem to be solved. And just like a woman's experience of labor is not something to save her from. She needs that experience. She needs that initiation. And I think one of the biggest things that helps a woman feel like she can meet it is that her partner trusts her to meet it.
Yeah. Yeah. We by far the best things that we've had in our relationship since day one is a weekly date night, Thursday night, tonight's date night, and also
Mm.
a weekly check-in, which we do on a Sunday for our relationship. So even if the rest of the week goes very pear-shaped, and those are like our two kind of touch points, at least there's, something that grounds us in what could be a bit of a passing ships in the night type
Yes.
energy, especially in that first 3 months, from what I understand.
Yeah, yeah, and just having a lot of grace for maybe the lack of sleep that you might both experience, and just recognizing that it's a season where maybe it's not about feeling happy or joyful or
Mm,
excited, but it's about, just learning to feel more too.
mm.
Because part of parenting is also, as our children get older, it's not about saving them from difficult feelings. It's about, how do I learn to be with more?
What have you done to allow that? I know, having been in the personal development space for a long time, I know I can only hold to the level that I've been myself. So I'm mindful that as I can continuously expand my capacity to meet the darkest parts of myself and the edges, that allows me to hold more for my partner and
Mm.
therefore our kid coming. But what's allowed you to navigate that? I'm guessing some kind of nervous system work has been
I
part
mean,
of it.
the child will show you all of the places where you are rigid.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, the interesting thing about having children is that they're here to reveal all of our own unloved parts. They're here to reveal who we are, like more of who we are, because our kids will push buttons until we become congruent. So you can have all of the shoulds that you want. You can have all of the things that, the ways that you might try to perform or be pleasant or be nice or kind, but our kids really try to get us congruent. And that's a beautiful thing, because then when we reveal parts of ourselves that we struggle with or that we deny, then we get an opportunity to work through that. And, just like we hurt through relationships, we heal through relationships. And I think this generation of parents can have this fanciful idea sometimes that I'm the cycle breaker, I'm going to change everything. But we live with primal nervous systems. You don't get to change everything in a generation. But what we do have is the willingness to often acknowledge where there's room for some repair, where maybe we acted out of alignment with how we want to act, and recognizing that, when we're stressed as parents and as humans, we're going to regress to like earlier parts of our brain, and our kids are a beautiful setup for that to happen. An interesting insight that I learned about trauma is that a child who has a traumatic background can become very, very left-brained and very analytical, and they can just basically depart their body, right? Like, I want to feel in control, so I'm going to go in my head. And so then I find a lot of mothers who have backgrounds in trauma then often go into therapy, and they go in to do their doctorates, and they go into do all of their things because they're experts at being analytical. But the most powerful and profound transformation comes with parenting a child who makes you stay in your body, because we're really parenting, like 80% of parenting happens before we open our mouth. Like, we're parenting with our energy. And that's why it's wise to put emphasis on, like, what do we need to be able to stay in our body? What do we need to be able to move towards uncomfortable sensations in our body? What are our habitual ways to numb? What are our habitual ways that we regulate? Because we all have a way of doing that, whether we're conscious of it or not.
I resonate with that. I feel like not so much in this relationship, in previous relationships, my partners would talk about Coach Blake, which is the very rigid identity that I carry. And I can only imagine, with the way in which I want to be prepared as best as possible, that's my protection mechanism that I'm kind of looking to kind of work with. And as you said, it will become quite rigid and probably get blown up. So it's really interesting when you talk about conscious parenting. And I can only assume you playing in this space for so long. There's such a significant difference in the school of thought between our child being a mirror for us and revealing where we've still got work to do, and the child being the problem.
Yeah. So children are often like the canary in the coal mine, right? Like, the child
Say that again. The what?
that phrase, that turn of phrase, the canary in the coal mine. You know how like
Never heard it.
like they send the canary out if there's like a problem in the coal mine, right? Like, it tells you like what's going on.
Yeah.
So what that means is that the child's often the expressing what the parents repress, right? So if the parents have a lot of tension, they don't want to argue in front of the kids, or there's like some major family drama and they're shoving it under the rug, and the parents think, oh, no one can see it. The child sees that rug and feels that rug full of lumps, right? And the child's brain is scanning for threats. right? They're looking for threats in the environment, and incongruence is one of the threats. The unknown is a threat. So I'm hearing you with wanting to be prepared is like it's your threat response going, I want to control for the unknown, which is beautiful. But of course, as we know, you can't control for every unknown. All we can do is support ourselves to adapt to whatever comes up for us. And so I do think that we see an enormous amount of pressure maybe on healthcare systems to fix children, but I don't think you can look at a child, especially a young child, in isolation from its family dynamic. I just don't.
It'd be impossible. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that really frustrated me about the school system. And I went to very good schools in Melbourne, is I was like a proper rat bag, like the biggest distraction. But no one ever really, it seemed like no one ever really considered why. I was like obviously it makes sense now, but at the time I just felt like a burden. I felt like a burden at home, and then I felt like a burden and an inconvenience at school because I was a rat bag, and all the reasoning that comes with that. But I don't remember. I had one footy coach who, and he's the only, to be honest, he's the only one's name that I remember now. A guy called Lenny. He's the only one that kind of ever asked any questions. No one ever else seemed to like ask any questions as to how I was the way I was, which I find fascinating. But to your point, how can it not be related to
I do think
your
it's
upbringing?
I think it's a confronting thing for many of us to acknowledge, right? Like it requires an enormous amount of humility for adults to say, well, all of these children walking around, like, yes, they're their own whole soul and whole people, but also they are very much products of the environments in which we raise them. And so that requires an enormous amount of individual responsibility for the homes we create, but also like on a social and political level, and a responsibility on the institutions that we create. And I think we're too, if you look at politics, far too short term to own that. And also I do think we can become as humans almost too self-righteous and prideful to really like sit in the mess of that. So that's why I think it can get ignored on a more collective level.
What would you recommend for us in the first, say, 3 months? We've got girlfriends reaching out about meal trains, which is all these things. And I'm like, oh my God, this is another
meal trains. Honestly, the best present for a new mother is not a grow suit, it is a meal.
Yeah.
Meal, sustenance, an opportunity to laugh. The great thing about like little babies is that you can pop them in a carrier and still take them so many places because they're not quite wide open to the world yet. And as long as they have the safety of one of your bodies, they're actually really quite settled. And so you can still go on picnics and really still do the things that you really love. That's what's so beautiful. It's like I used to be terrified when I had my first child, who was like this precious, gorgeous, perfect little newborn. And I'd see these terrorizing toddlers and I'd be like, oh God, like get that child away from me. But you don't get given the toddler, right? Like you grow with the newborn, becomes the slightly more mobile baby who then becomes a toddler, and you're ready for that when it's your time. So I think it's just finding a rhythm where you feel like you have some sustenance to get through the days and the nights, and you don't lose too many pieces of you in that process.
So what would a rhythm potentially look like in the first 3 months? I love like one of my favorite things that I'm looking for, like every afternoon I go for a walk, which is like a 5K walk around here, and just love the thought of taking my daughter Carrie and just cruising in the afternoons if that's how things play out. But
it's a great time of day too, because if you're walking in the afternoon or evening, like it helps the baby with a circadian rhythm. It helps them as they get a little bit older, like regulating their melatonin levels. So that's like a great rhythm to have. I do think definitely getting out of the house. I think trying to have any kind of feeding schedule is unwise. I think you just use your baby as the cue as to whether they're hungry or not.
They'll tell you when they're hungry is what you mean.
Yeah. They'll tell you when they're hungry. And newborn babies, like I think some parents can think, the baby goes to bed at 7 and then like they sleep till 7. And that's really not how it goes. Like newborn babies are often like, sleep for 3 hours, awake for a bit, sleep for 1 hour, awake for, it's hard to predict, but they might often only go to bed at like 9:30 at night or something. So there won't always be like that nighttime that you might think that you can get until they're a little bit older. But yeah, I think any kind of schedule needs to be dictated by both the baby's needs and maybe its stimulation needs, which is not great, because if you imagine the baby's been muffled by the world for 9 months and then there's just so much going on. So just noticing, like, if your baby's maybe a little bit overwhelmed, and then keeping them in a bit of more of a cocoon some days. But the best rhythm is really the one where you're all checking in with each other and seeing what you need. And that's, I don't think there's no one way, because it depends on what your interests are.
So based on your understanding and expertise, from a schedule point of view, how do you navigate? Like, is there any schedule? Is there recommendations? Because I know some people, some of our friends need to be home at a certain time, whereas others are super cruisy, like, oh, the kids will come with us. If they're asleep, they sleep under the rug, whatever. So I'm like, yeah.
It's often a parent with the first child who's like, I mean, I wasn't so much like this, but I do see that like a lot with parents of like the first child, like, yes, I need to be sleeping at this time, and this is our kind of, and that can help some parents feel like in control of their day. But usually by the second or third child, you've got multiple places to be, and you can't always be home for those sleeps. And so they have to become more adaptable. So by the third child, they just learn to have all of their naps in the pram or in a carrier, and they really never slept in a cot. None of my children slept in cots. They all slept in beds. But just noticing, like how much, it's like some people say like the child's just going to fit into our life, and we'll orient our whole life around the child. I think it's a bit of a give and take, like in how much can we like bend things to take our child out for dinner, because we would really love to go out for dinner, but also how can we be flexible enough that if they're having a really overstimulated day or night, that we can change those plans.
If you were leaning to one side or the other in terms of the child fitting into your life or you fitting the child, which way would you lean as an expert in this space? I'm mindful, as you said, to kind of dance with it, but if you were
I think probably if I was to choose one way to lean, I probably would lean more towards adapting to the child's life, only because I think that as a society, we don't have a very developmentally aligned expectation of children. So I do think that as a culture, our cultural narrative tends to be just take the kids anywhere and like they'll just adapt. But that doesn't actually consider how wide open children's senses are. And therefore, if we don't consider the sensory overwhelm that we can put children through when we do that, we're then getting behavioural issues because you actually haven't had expectations that are realistic for where that child's at.
That's fascinating. So when it comes to their senses, my partner and I are mindful of, TVs and iPads, and everyone's got the best intention of not putting an iPad in front of them at dinner and not watching TV. From a sensory overload point of view, we live in Byron, so that first probably is a bit of a tick in terms of not too much going on around us, which is excellent. Yeah. But what else would you have us consider in that first, say, 6 to 12 months in terms of sensory overload and navigating that?
Yeah, babies don't need to be entertained. So one thing, and this can be hard for parents because I feel like, but like part of me, them knowing that I'm here and knowing that I love them is me connecting with them. But one of the most beautiful things you can do is, I did this with my second child, was I used to lay her, like she was only maybe a month old, and I used to lay her on the ground, like right near the window with this like soft curtain, and I have the door open just a tiny bit. And sometimes she would lay there and she would watch that curtain blow in the wind for 20 minutes. And that was enough. She didn't need anything else. She didn't need us to talk to her. She didn't need us to give her a toy. Like that stimulation and all of the input that was going on for her was just enrapturing for her. And I think because as adults, we've learned to filter our environment so well, we forget that kids haven't learned that yet. And that part of our job as parents is to organize our child's sensory world. So when they're babies, it can look like that. When they're older, it can look like, no, I'm not letting you have the iPad, or like it can look like remembering that part of one of the benefits of our parents and grandparents' generations was that they were sent outside all day. And so they had so much proprioceptive input, like they just were outside, they were outdoors, they were climbing trees, they were running, and they just had so much opportunity for their nervous systems to become really well developed and regulated. And as we've become so much more technologically based, and probably as a parenting culture more protective, we've removed some of those really important developmental milestones for children. We've almost given them too much than what they can handle.
Where do you think we're overprotective? Because I think about that a bit as well. And also even where do you think we're potentially over restrictive in terms of that kind of authoritative figure? Because I know for me, it backfired on my parents because they tried to rein things in, and that only exacerbated my desire to rebel. So how do you find that dance for you?
I think, I mean, an example maybe is with my son, like when he was 10, I got him one of those like watches that the kids can get, and like they have, like they can call you on the watch and they can like go for bike rides. And so by the time he was 10, he had that, and I'd get him to go get bread and milk for me, so it's giving him autonomy, responsibility. He's having to navigate risk. And I think there's a lot of parents who still wouldn't do that even at 10, whereas that was commonplace, 2 generations ago.
Yeah, even my generation.
Yeah,
I went to get my parents cigarettes.
Yeah, 80s, right? 80s and
the 90s.
Whereas I think there's a little bit more, and also because we live in such a convenient society, right? Like you could Uber Eats stuff, you could have it delivered, but in doing that, we remove opportunities for our kids to stretch and to, have conversations, to negotiate, society beyond us. And that's really important for their sense of self.
On that, and this potentially, for whatever reason, is a thought that I have maybe more than any of these. I don't know where and why it continues to play on my mind, but that dance of resilience of one of my fears is over coddling them to the point where they got no resilience, because in the world that we live, life's pretty good.
Yeah.
And I saw, despite the fact I would never want anyone to go through my upbringing, the value of hardship, dysfunction, and how that's actually served me.
Suck it up and toughen up, kind of.
That mentality. So I'm dancing between, these kids living the good life and the downside of living the good life. How do you dance that piece?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we consider resilience in terms of like the way that a nervous system becomes resilient, our children become resilient the number of times they can move from being dysregulated, which is a lot of the time. So if you imagine a child's brain development, they're living in emotion and reaction most of the time, because it's only the prefrontal cortex that has logic, planning, it's able to calm down the other centers of the brain. So one of the biggest ways we can help our children become more resilient is to allow see it as developmentally normal that they're going to become dysregulated, irrational, however we want to label it. And that our job is to actually see that as normal, not see it as something we have to fix or like shove a screen in front of or shove a lolly in the mouth of, and go, you're actually becoming resilient through your ability to experience this feeling. And I'm just going to wait with you until you come back into balance again. And then the next time you lose it, that's also building resilience. So every time a child moves from dysregulation and regulation back again, like this kind of ongoing almost weaving, I suppose, that builds a resilient nervous system. But we as parents undermine that if we try to fix, if we avoid the things that we know might set them off, if we smooth over their problems for them and fix them rather than allow them to walk their path. A great analogy is like, imagine that you've got a child and they're kind of doing some sweeping, and to make them less resilient, what we would do is grab the broom off them and sweep in front of them, right? To be careless would be to push them with the broom and go, off you go, it's all yours, deal with it. But to help them build a sense of strong attachment and secure attachment within themselves and us, and resilience would be to stand next to them and not hold the broom, but say to them, which way do you think you might sweep now? What do you think is the best way to go here? So we kind of walk that path with them, not in front, not behind, but walk them trusting that they'll find within them what they need to get through that thing.
Bridget, this has been excellent. My first of many podcast chats with those that know parenting a lot better than me. And there's a lot for me to digest. So I want to thank you for giving the expertise and the insights into the game that you've been playing on a personal level for 11 years. And professionally, I'm not too sure how long, but that has been super valuable for me and hopefully for my partner as well. So thank you for that. For those that want to find out more about you and the work that you do, where's the best spot to send them?
Yeah, come and find me on my website, bridgetwood.life. And I'm also on Instagram, Facebook, all the socials. And if you want to have a listen to my podcast, we are coming up to episode 500. So
Jesus.
is
Okay.
9.5 years, nearly 10 years of weekly podcasts. So that's over at Nourishing the Mother.
Awesome. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Blake. See you.